Good morning, everyone. Today I am here to present my seminar on the topic of parietal and temporal lobe anatomy and functions, and my moderator is Dr. Veena ma'am. We will study parietal lobe under the following headings and the temporal lobe under the following heading. Parietal lobe. Parietal lobe occupies 1/4 of each hemisphere. Parietal lobe occupies about 1/4 of each hemisphere. It is involved in two primary functions: sensations and perception, and second is the integration and interpretation of sensory information. Thus, it is responsible for integrating sensory input to form a single perception, that is cognition, on the one hand, while also forming a spatial coordinate system to represent our world on the other hand. Anatomy of the parietal lobe. Parietal lobe is located between the Parietal lobe is located between the frontal and the occipital lobe and above the temporal lobe on each cerebral hemisphere. Its borders are as follows. Anterior border is formed by the central sulcus of the Rolando. Posterior border is formed by the imaginary line extending between the parieto-occipital sulcus superiorly and the pre-occipital notch inferiorly. Inferior border is formed by the lateral fissure, that is Sylvian fissure, and superior border is formed by the medial longitudinal fissure that separates the two hemispheres. Close the door behind you. Parietal lobe is located between the frontal and the occipital lobe, and it is also present above the temporal lobe on each cerebral hemisphere. Its borders are as follows. Anterior border is formed by the central sulcus of Rolando. Posterior border is formed by the imaginary line extending between the parieto-occipital sulcus and the pre-occipital notch, and the inferior border is formed by the lateral fissure of the sulcus. And inferior parietal lobule, lobule with the intraparietal sulcus. The inferior parietal lobule continues to the parieto-temporal intersection and is formed by the supramarginal gyrus and the angular gyrus. Supramarginal gyrus surrounds the posterior end of the lateral fissure, while on the other hand, angular gyrus is found at the posterior tip of the superior temporal gyrus. But blood supply of the parietal lobe, the lateral surface of the parietal lobe is supplied by the middle cerebral artery, one of the three branches of the internal carotid artery. Another of the internal carotid artery branches is the anterior cerebral artery, which supplies the medial surface of the parietal lobe, and the posterior cerebral artery supplies the posterior surface of the medial parietal lobe. Functional cortical mapping. Parietal lobe is involved in the following function: sensation of touch, pain, temperature, information processing, cognition, spatial orientation, coordination of movement, visual perception, speech, reading, writing, and calculation. This is a diagram depicting the Brodmann areas. This is the primary somatosensory area, Brodmann area 3, 2, 1, which is also known as the sensory homunculus, which is formed by the postcentral gyrus. On the other hand, parietal association cortex area, Brodmann area 5, 7, which is formed by the superior parietal lobe. There is also sensory speech area of Wernicke, area number 22, 39, and 40. Primary somatosensory area, which is formed by the postcentral gyrus. This gyrus receives the sensory information from all the sensory receptors that provide information related to temperature, pain, which is from the spinothalamic pathway, and vibration, proprioception, and fine touch, which is via the dorsal column pathway. On this side, can you explain which way is parietal? Sir, yes. Sir, this is the post-central gyrus. Sir, this is the superior parietal lobule. Sir, there is interparietal sulcus, and this is the inferior parietal lobule, sir. And sir, this is the central sulcus, dividing it into the pre-central gyrus and post-central gyrus. And inferiorly, yes. Sir, inferiorly, yes. Sir, this is the superior temporal gyrus, sir, which is this is the temporal lobe, which is divided by two sulci. That is, sir, occipital lobe, sir, starts from parieto-occipital sulcus. Yes, sir. Parieto-occipital sulcus. Yes, sir. This is the occipital lobe. This is the parietal lobe. This is frontal lobe, and this is temporal. Sensory homunculus. Sensory homunculus is formed by the postcentral gyrus. The parts of the body are neurologically mapped on the somatosensory cortex. It is a pictorial somatotopic representation of the human body on the postcentral gyrus, which is referred to as cortical sensory homunculus devised by the Wilder-Penfield. Sensory map. This sensory map consists of an upside-down representation of the body running superior-inferiorly along the post-central gyrus. Point-for-point correspondence of the body on the gyrus results in a disproportionate figure with large hands, lips, and face compared to the rest of the body, because the areas that are finely controlled or have acute sensation have larger portion of the somatosensory cortex. This is a diagram depicting the somatosensory homunculus. Parietal association cortex, which is formed by the superior parietal lobule, it plays an important role in planned movements, spatial reasoning, and attention. Intraparietal sulcus can be further divided into lateral, medial, ventral, and anterior area. The lateral area of the intraparietal sulcus leads to eye movements in response to a stimulus in space. Medial area determines how far and where we need to reach in relation to our nose. Ventral area receives a number of sensory modalities like auditory, visual, vestibular, and somatosensory information. Anterior area leads to the interpretation in the size, shape, and position of the objects we are about to grasp, and anterior and ventral areas work together to enable visual motor coordination of the hand movements. BAUM'S loop. Optic radiations from the lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus. Two loops of fibers carry information back to the visual area. One is the Mayer's loop, other is the BAUM'S loop. Mayer's loop carries information for superior part of the visual field. On the other hand, BAUM'S loop carry information for the inferior part of the visual field. Mayer's loop runs through the temporal lobe, while on the other hand, BAUM'S loop run through the parietal lobe to terminate in the occipital lobe. Lesion in the Mayer's loop will lead to an contralateral upper quadrantanopia, which is also known as the pie in the sky visual deficit. On the other hand, damage to the BAUM'S loop will lead to contralateral lower quadrantanopia or pie in the floor visual deficit. Dominant versus non-dominant hemispheres, the parietal lobes control calculation and language on the dominant side. On the other hand, sensory visuospatial processing is carried out by the non-dominant hemisphere of the parietal lobe. Now we will discuss about some clinical conditions related to the damage to parietal lobe. Number one is the receptive aphasia. Damage to the Wernicke's region will result in a receptive aphasia, which is fluent form of aphasia. Destructive lesions restricted to the Wernicke's area produce a loss of ability to understand spoken and written language. Since the Broca area is another very important area for language processing is unaffected, the patient can produce fluent speech. However, the patient is unaware of the meaning of the words used and uses incorrect or even non-existent words, which is known as the word salad. The affected patient also appears to be unaware of this deficit. Balint syndrome. It is due to the large bilateral lesions of the parietal lobe, which leads to the deficits in the visual attention and motor function. Symptoms include simultagnosia, in which the patient is not able to interpret to see the whole visual field. Number second symptom is optic ataxia. The patient is not able to move their hands in relation to their visual input. Number third is optic apraxia, and inability to fixate the eyes. This syndrome is usually attributed to simultaneous. Therefore, it is a rare disease, often mistaken for blindness related to other disorder due to the range of symptoms and manifestation. Parietal lobe stroke. Ischemic strokes are commonly the result of atherosclerotic emboli. Middle cerebral artery is the largest branch of the internal carotid artery and a direct continuation of the artery. It is therefore the commonest location of ischemic stroke. The middle cerebral artery supplies the lateral surface of the parietal lobe as well as the superior temporal lobe, which is the location of the upper limb and face on the primary somatosensory cortex. Therefore, strokes impacting the middle cerebral artery result in sensory loss of these areas with sparing of the lower limbs. Motor function of the same areas may also result, as the primary motor cortex is just cerebral artery. Symptoms of the parietal lobe strokes are hemineglect, optic ataxia, amorphosynthesis, apraxia. Hemispatial neglect follows damage to the non-dominant parietal lobe. Patient able to see both sides of their visual fields in both the eyes, but not able to interpret the sensory information sent to the brain from one half of the visual field. If a stroke occurs in the right parietal lobe, the patient will ignore the left visual field. If a stroke occurs in left parietal lobe, the ability of the patient to solve mathematical problems as well as reading and writing would be impaired. The symptoms of optic ataxia result in issues with patient reaching for objects in contralateral visual field to the affected parietal lobe. Amorphosynthesis is a condition where patient is unaware of somatic sensation from one side of the body and is a possible result of parietal lobe stroke. Left lobe, if is affected, it will lead to agnosia, a loss of general perception. A lesion of the right parietal lobe causes issues with the person's interpretation of the left side of their visual field as well as their personal space. Apraxia is a disorder of motor control that usually results from damage to the left parietal lobe. GERSTMANN'S syndrome. It is due to damage to inferior parietal lobule in the dominant hemisphere, that is most likely the left hemisphere, and is associated with right-left confusion and characteristic symptoms including agraphia, which is difficulty in writing, acalculia, which is difficulty in mathematics, aphasia, language disorders, and agnosia, difficulty to perceive objects. Temporal lobe. After the frontal lobe, temporal lobe is the second largest lobe of the brain, accounting for just over 20% of the neocortical volume. Occupies middle cranial fossa, and its name relates to its proximity to the temporal region or bone of the skull. This is a diagram depicting the temporal lobe from the superolateral surface, from the inferior surface. Location and boundaries of the temporal lobe. Temporal lobe is visible on the lateral, medial, and basal surfaces of the cerebral hemisphere. Borders of the temporal lobe. On the lateral surface, it is demarcated superiorly by the lateral sulcus, of the sylvian, and extends ventrally to the inferior surface of the cerebrum. Posteriorly, the temporal lobe extends to an arbitrary line running between the top of the parieto-occipital sulcus and the pre-occipital notch. This is a diagram depicting parieto-occipital sulcus, and this is pre-occipital notch. This forms the posterior border of the temporal lobe. On the inferior or medial surfaces, the posterior boundary of the temporal lobe is an imaginary line that extends from the pre-occipital notch to the splenium of the corpus callosum. Medially, the temporal lobe is separated from the limbic lobe by the collateral sulcus. The lateral surface of the temporal lobe consists of three parallel gyri: the superior temporal gyri, the middle temporal gyri, and inferior temporal gyri. The superior temporal gyri depicts the Brodmann area number 22, middle temporal gyri depicts Brodmann area 21, and inferior temporal gyri depicts Brodmann area number 20. There are two sulci which divides the temporal lobe into the superior, middle, and inferior gyri. Number one is the superior temporal sulcus, which runs parallel to the lateral sulcus, ends by curving up into the parietal lobe, which is capped by the angular gyrus, as I have explained in previous slide. Inferior temporal sulcus separates the middle temporal gyri and inferior temporal gyri and runs parallel to the superior temporal sulcus. Posterior and also ascends into the parietal lobe. These are the diagrams depicting inferior surface of the temporal lobe, inferior temporal gyrus, which continues on to the inferior surface of the temporal lobe. Occipitotemporal gyrus, fusiform. It is also known as the fusiform gyri. The remainder of the inferior surface is composed of occipitotemporal gyri, which is separated from the limbic lobe by the collateral sulcus, which extends between temporal and occipital lobes. Mid-fusiform sulcus separates the medial and the lateral occipitotemporal gyrus. Medial and lateral occipitotemporal gyrus. Functions of the temporal lobe. Mainly the function is related to auditory, and the primary auditory cortex, which is the area number 41, is located to anterior transverse temporal gyrus, and secondary auditory cortex is located at the posterior transverse temporal gyrus. These are the specialized part of the cortex responsible for the reception of auditory information via the auditory radiation from the medial geniculate nucleus. Sensory speech area of Wernicke, area number 22, 39, and 40. It is important for language development and for comprehension of speech. Functions are in language comprehension, semantic processing, language recognition, and language interpretation. Posterior part of the superior temporal gyrus, usually in the left cerebral hemisphere. This is a diagram depicting the Wernicke's area. Most neuroscientists also include regions of the inferior parietal lobule, particularly the supramarginal gyrus and the angular gyrus in the Wernicke's areas also. Supramarginal gyrus forms the auditory area of speech, and angular gyrus form the visual area of the speech. Other areas of the temporal lobe. The remainder of the temporal lobe, particularly the inferior surface, contains non-auditory association cortex and is involved in the processing of the visual information. Blood supply of the temporal lobe. The lateral surface of the temporal lobe is supplied primarily by the branches of the middle cerebral artery, the larger of the two terminal branches of the internal carotid artery. The inferior surface of the temporal lobe is supplied primarily by the branches of the posterior cerebral artery arising from the vertebro-basilar system. Medial temporal lobe, which is also known as the mesial temporal lobe, is located in the medial aspect of the temporal lobe, it is distinct from the rest of the temporal lobe, which is formed by the neocortex. This term refers to several structures that are part of what is known as the limbic lobe, the amygdala, hippocampus, uncus, dentate gyrus, and parahippocampal gyrus. These structures are fundamental in the processing of learning and memory, as well as in the regulation of the emotions. These are my references. Questions, anyone? No questions? Okay. Temporal lobe. Okay, what kind of visuals as well as so what problem do they cause? Like so they can be confused. What is finger agnosia? Is right step. We cross-examine on the patient itself. We ask him to touch his left ear, right? Then we ask the patient to do the same thing on the examiner. That we ask him to point to the right hand of the examiner. We'll ask him to point to his right hand to the left ear of the examiner. We cross-examine. What is your thesis topic? Which side are you doing? Right and left side. Right and left. No. Specifically, which area are you doing? People. In English.
You are doing this. You presented all the information that was there, but say you know academic more about visual. So a lot of the places it was difficult to follow because there were but go image search, Google search for the item, you search for images. So you get image for that, for example, those optical radiations, Myers group. Should have taken like Grace, soft copy, yeah, you refer to the book. So you can do there are a lot of yes. So the trick is that you put it on full screen and then you do a say print screen or screenshot of the laptop. Work on that. This images also for all the syndromes that you presented. So it is difficult to visualize. Okay, when you are saying that this area is scripted, area, yes. Okay, so it is easier to follow if you have that में तो भाई ना कि if you are writing question if you अगर आपका पूरा कोई इधर filter तो है अगर आप चार diagram well labeled बना दिए तो you pass. If you write 14 pages, it is difficult. So you should have included more images in the description part when you are describing. Also your slides are a little bit, you can say, because your title was running somewhere. Okay. So you have worked hard, but I think 1 hour of work would have added a lot of value to what you were wanting to do. 1 hour of additional work. Okay. So my suggestion is when you are doing this kind of thing, ask one of your colleagues or someone to present 1, 2, 3, 4 slides because they are understanding. It is difficult to follow this information without visual cues. Yes. Okay. That is my only suggestion. Otherwise, the information is there. You put it all there. You've done the hard work. You've collected the information, and you've understood it. You can explain it. So, if you have images, it will be easier for you also to explain what exactly is what happening. As group जैसे हो तो सिर्फ एक ही उसमें नहीं रहते हैं. And anatomy we have described the problem. You can say what we have, how we have divided the lobes. Functionally, it becomes difficult because, for example, the arterial supply. So we can divide it on the arterial supply also. That would be more beneficial because if there is a stroke, yes. So it follows the the symptoms that we get is the area that is affected, right? And you yourself said that blood supply, it does not, one lobe is not supplied by one artery. So if middle cerebral artery is affected, then we see some of different lobes getting affected. All right. Yes. Similarly, functionally also, the division of lobes that we have anatomically. So we study anatomically, but if you see functionally also, the areas run across borders. For example, even you are saying Broca's area or sensory motor area, speech, sound. So they run across the different lobes. Okay. So that is the problem because when you are studying it in form of lobes, so you will certain information will be repeated. Okay, so that is one main difficulty while you are preparing, for example, your writing or describing, for example, parietal lobe. But the disorders they may, for example, middle cerebral artery, fusion or ischemia, but it will have symptoms that are not only limited to parietal lobe. Right? So that way you may have to include functionally at times you may have to include information from different areas. All right. We have seminar on artery supply also for pre-ops. Who's doing that? Who said we done? My suggestion only is include more images. You could have decreased the slide only images and explain. briefly what is there. So it would have made sense, more interesting. When are you doing, Aditya?